In the summer of 1945, there was no brighter star in the entertainment galaxy than Harry Crosby Jr., better known by his childhood nickname, Bing. 42 years old that summer, he was the world's reigning superstar, the Taylor Swift of his day, except that he had accomplished far more. He'd been a recording star for almost 20 years, and a movie star for 13. Just the previous year, in 1944, he'd won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was a trifecta superstar, on the big screen, on the stage, and on the radio. American polls ranked him as the most admired man in the world, scoring even higher than the Pope. World War II was still raging in the Pacific that summer, and American boys were dying by the thousands in faraway places like Okinawa and the Philippines. The hardships were being felt by everyone. And nobody was more influential in boosting American morale than Bing Crosby. He entertained troops all over the world and appeared in countless cities across America. He raised millions upon millions of dollars during war bond drives, which were absolutely essential for winning that terribly expensive war. Arguably, Bing Crosby did more to rally Americans than any other individual. He met thousands of servicemen and women during that effort, but he became especially friendly with a 24-year-old baby-faced war hero, an Army major, who was also at the very top of his particular heap as a fighter ace. Richard Ira Bong, known by the common nickname Dick, had returned home after 3 combat tours in the Southwest Pacific. A P-38 pilot, he had shot down 40 enemy planes, more than any other American. And he accomplished this at a time when aerial dogfights occurred between piston-engine planes fitted with machine guns and automatic cannons. A pilot had to get in close, and then destroy the enemy plane with heavy gunfire. Major Bong was not only officially credited with destroying 40 Japanese planes, he had probably destroyed another 7 and damaged 11 more during his 3 overseas tours. Bong's American victory record still holds to this day, and it's hard to conceive that it will ever be broken. It was a mighty big accomplishment for a mild-mannered farm boy from Wisconsin. He was the shooting star among American fighter pilots, and he'd been awarded the Medal of Honor. In early 1945, he came home for good and received an exuberant hero's welcome. He visited with his family on their small farm and married his hometown sweetheart. Like Bing Crosby, Major Bong was on top of the world, and in the summer of 1945, he and his new bride moved to sunny California. He had a dream assignment, flying acceptance check flights in the hottest new plane in the military, the jet-powered Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, as the fighters came off the assembly line in Burbank. The assignment also brought Major Bong back into Bing Crosby's orbit. They had spent some time together earlier that year, conducting radio programs and at least one public appearance, and Bing had not forgotten Bong. In fact, Bing, who was a gifted amateur golfer, invited Bong to join him for a round at the Lakeside Country Club on Monday, August 6. But the golf outing was canceled that morning. Although the exact reason is unknown, it might have been because of breaking war news being broadcast on the radio. At 11 a.m. Eastern Wartime in Washington, D.C., or 8 a.m. out on the West Coast, radio stations began broadcasting a recorded statement from President Harry Truman.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb.
The stunning radio broadcast heralded the dawn of a new and profound era in human history. And tragically for Richard Bong, The cancellation of the golf outing with Bing Crosby drastically altered the course of his young life. Among the millions of Scandinavians who immigrated to America in the late 1800s and early 1900s, a large percentage settled in the upper Midwest, including members of the Bong family from Sweden. Richard Ira Bong was born in 1920 in northern Wisconsin, not far from the shores of Lake Superior, on a farm near Poplar, a small village with a couple of stores and a Lutheran church and one small school surrounded by thousands of acres of farmland and woodlands. Richard was the first of 9 children and grew up in a crowded but happy home on a farm of 80 acres. From an early age, everyone had a routine of daily chores, tending to the livestock or helping to plant and harvest crops. It was a wholesome existence. Richard, who was soon nicknamed Dick, practically grew up outdoors. He went hunting and fishing at every opportunity, helping to provide food for the self-sustaining family. In between his school days and chores, Dick loved outdoor sports and all sorts of boyhood adventures. Although he grew to only about 5 feet 6 inches tall, Dick had a stocky, athletic build. He was physically strong from chores as well as operating the farm machinery, particularly a big caterpillar crawler his father used for grading roads and hauling timber. Dick learned to manhandle its heavy clutch pedals and steering controls, which developed coordination as well as strength. Dick was known around the area for his athletic abilities, especially baseball during the summer months and hockey in the winter. And from an early age, he was enthralled with airplanes. As one of his sisters explained, he would get fascinated when he saw an airplane in the sky. His eyes would get very blue, and he'd be in sort of a daydream until the plane went out of his sight. After graduating from high school in 1938, Dick attended the Superior State Teachers College for 2 years. He also enrolled in the civilian pilot training program and fulfilled his dream by learning to fly at the municipal airport. In the spring of 1941, he enlisted in the Army's Aviation Cadet Program, which took him far from his small-town roots to California for flight training. He flew Stearman biplanes during primary, BT-13s in basic training, and finally moved on to Luke Field in Arizona to fly the T-6 Advanced Trainer. He earned his wings and a commission as a second lieutenant in early 1942 and remained at Luke Field temporarily as a flight instructor. One highlight of this period was his minor participation in a Hollywood movie, Thunderbirds, in which he flew one of the T-6 Texan trainers seen in the opening of the film. After instructing for 5 months, Dick was rewarded with orders to the 49th Fighter Squadron at Hamilton Field near San Francisco, which operated the twin-engine Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Piloting the big fighter was truly a dream come true for young Lieutenant Bong. He proved to be a natural at the controls of the P-38, was an excellent dogfighter, and flew with the exuberance and occasionally the recklessness of a 21-year-old. There are stories that he and 3 other pilots illegally flew under the Golden Gate Bridge and then looped around the center span. Dick firmly denied taking part in that shenanigan, but he was busted for performing a high-speed pass at very low altitude over a local neighborhood. For that reckless maneuver, he was called on the carpet in front of the commander of the 4th Air Force, General George Kenney. Upon meeting Bong for the first time, Kenney described him as just a little blonde-haired Swedish boy, though Kenney himself was actually a few inches shorter than Bong. Kenny gave him a stern reprimand, and Bong was grounded for 6 weeks. But he had met the man who would become his biggest promoter and champion in the air war overseas. Lieutenant Bong arrived in Australia in late 1942 and soon moved up to New Guinea to begin his first combat tour at an airstrip near Port Moresby. Conditions were primitive. Personnel lived in canvas tents. Their army food was simple. The weather was oppressively hot and humid, and sanitation was almost non-existent. Flying conditions were extremely hazardous over the dense jungle and the treacherous Owen Stanley Mountains. Dick's first few missions were uneventful, but on December 27, 1942, he shot down 2 enemy planes and, somewhat surprisingly, was awarded a Silver Star, an impressive start to his combat record. General Kenny, who had reprimanded Dick in San Francisco only a few months earlier, was now in command of the 5th Air Force and visited the airstrip to congratulate Dick and his squadron mates. Over the next several months, Bong saw numerous combat actions, participating in major engagements such as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in early March 1943, Admiral Yamamoto's last big offensive in April, followed by frequent engagements as the battle for New Guinea and the advance towards the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul came to a crescendo. By November 1943, he was involved in heavy combat engagements over Rabaul itself and had racked up 21 victories. The American record stood at 26 credited victories, jointly held by Eddie Rickenbacker of World War I fame and Marine pilot Joe Foss from his exploits in the Guadalcanal campaign. And now Bong was ranked among the top American aces as well. He had earned several more combat awards and was promoted 2 ranks to captain. In mid-November 1943, after a full year overseas, he returned to the States for 2 months of home leave and publicity events. He went hunting with family and friends, but was in high demand for interviews by the press, and his achievements were publicized in numerous newspaper and magazine articles. During a homecoming event at Superior State Teachers College, he met Marjorie Vattendahl, the previous year's homecoming queen, and they fell in love practically overnight. They dated at every opportunity, but as a celebrated war hero, Dick was sent to the East Coast to participate in public relations events and radio broadcasts in Washington, D.C. and New York. After 2 months in the States, Captain Bong returned to the Southwest Pacific for another combat tour. In early February 1944, he was assigned a P-38J, serial number 42-103993, and about a month later he decorated its nose with an enlarged photograph of his sweetheart, Marge Vattendahl. The P-38 became famous thanks to numerous publicity photographs and Dick's rising fame as a decorated ace. But only a couple of weeks later, it crashed in the New Guinea jungle, flown by another pilot who was forced to bail out. Within just a few weeks, Bong raised his score to 27 victories, breaking the existing record. An overseas live radio broadcast was arranged with Eddie Rickenbacker, who was genuinely pleased that his score of 26 had been eclipsed. News of Bong's achievement was reported extensively across the U.S. and even worldwide. Soon thereafter, he was promoted to major and sent back home. He was a hot commodity for public relations and war bond drives, but Dick, always modest, hated dealing with this storm of publicity. Reporters followed him everywhere, encroaching on his time during 3 weeks of leave on the farm in Poplar. But he was happy to play with his dog, and family gatherings now included Marge. They talked about getting married, but Dick was determined to go back for yet another combat tour first and see the war to its conclusion. There was work to do, he told Marge. He had lost wingmen and friends in combat and knew the high stakes, so he didn't want Marge to possibly become a war widow. Before returning to the combat zone, he went on a cross-country war bond tour, flying a P-38 decorated with the Marge photograph and the stylized name. He met with top brass in Washington, including General Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces. He performed an impromptu flight demonstration over Poplar and the city of Superior, flying lower than the tip of the flagpole at one of the shipyards. The war bond tour concluded with several days in Los Angeles, where he hobnobbed with some of the biggest Hollywood stars: Barbara Stanwyck, Jack Benny, and the biggest star of all, Bing Crosby. Bing and Bong conducted radio broadcasts in a studio and appeared on stage in the Hollywood Bowl, all in the name of promoting war bonds to finance the war effort. When Bong returned to the Pacific for his third combat tour, General Kenny assigned him to Fighter Command Headquarters, knowing that the Ace of Aces would bring good publicity to the 5th Air Force. Bong served as a roving gunnery instructor, which allowed him to fly with different squadrons and cherry-pick the missions that offered the best likelihood of combat. He took advantage of the assignment and shot down another 13 enemy planes during the next few months. Dick's meteoric rise led to the all-time American record of 40 victories. In December 1944, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, presented by General Douglas MacArthur in the Philippines. By this time, several of the other top aces in the Southwest Pacific had been killed in combat, and the famed Pappy Boyington was missing in action. So General Kenny sent Major Bong home for good while he was still in one piece. The Ace of Aces went on another cross-country war bond tour before returning to Wisconsin, where he and Marge were married in February 1945 at the Concordia Lutheran Church in Superior. Hundreds of people attended the wedding, which was widely publicized in newspapers and magazines as one of the top romances of 1945. Dick and Marge set off for a honeymoon in California. They played in the snow at Sequoia National Park and were guests at several venues in Hollywood, where they met many top stars including Judy Garland, Angela Lansbury, Lucille Ball, and especially Bing Crosby, who had taken a shine to the modest, baby-faced Major and his new bride. They loved California, but headed east to Dayton, Ohio for a few months while Dick attended the test pilot program at Wright Field. The war was still on, and his goal was to fly the hottest fighter in America, the P-80. He had expressed this wish to Hap Arnold, who approved the Ace of Aces request. In June 1945, Dick and Marge returned to California, where Dick began to fly the P-80 at Lockheed's facility in Burbank. For a farm boy who had been so enthralled with airplanes, this was a dream come true. But the P-80 was plagued with problems, many of them involving the new technology of jet propulsion. The early Allison J-33 engine was prone to dangerous fuel flow malfunctions under high RPM conditions, and a dozen accidents, including 5 fatal crashes, had occurred by early August. Despite the serious issues, Lockheed was under tremendous pressure to produce enough P-80s to deploy a full fighter group to the Pacific by the end of the year. Dick slowly built flight time in the Shooting Star during short acceptance check flights. By the first week of August, he had conducted 11 of these brief flights, totaling slightly more than 4 hours in P-80s. He was living his dream. He and Marge were having a great time in California, and another big thrill came when Bing Crosby invited Dick to play a round of golf with him at the Lakeside Country Club on Monday, August the 6th. The golf outing was canceled for unknown reasons, so Dick headed to the Lockheed terminal to see if he could pick up a check flight. Only 3 days before, a YP-80 had exploded in midair over Kentucky, killing Major Ira Jones. That was the 5th fatal accident involving P-80s, and there had been several other mishaps, mostly caused by issues with the early centrifugal flow jets and the fuel pump on the Allison J-33 engine. Pilots were supposed to activate the emergency fuel pump prior to takeoff, but Dick had forgotten to do this on at least one of his previous flights. At 2:30 in the afternoon on August 6th, Dick manned a brand new Shooting Star and was cleared for takeoff from Burbank Airport. Several witnesses around the field stated that Dick's takeoff roll was normal until he climbed to about 50 feet over the runway intersection. They heard the engine cut out briefly, then saw a stream of white vapor trailing from the P-80. The engine ran roughly as the Shooting Star climbed to only about 400 feet and curved to the right. It was evident that Dick knew his plane was flaming out and would quit flying. He turned to avoid heavily populated residential areas, then released the canopy and jumped just before the fighter stalled and rolled more steeply to the right. The P-80 came down in a utility right-of-way that bisected a neighborhood, crashing into vacant land just off the intersection of Salsuna Avenue and Calvert Street. But Dick had jumped too low for his parachute to deploy and was killed instantly upon impact with the ground. He was just 24 years old. Emergency personnel soon arrived on the scene, and a large crowd gathered as Dick's body was loaded into an Army ambulance. The burned wreckage was widely scattered, although the malfunctioning engine remained mostly intact. As word got out that the deceased pilot was Richard Bong, an unscrupulous radio station broadcast the news before the Army had an opportunity to notify the next of kin. Marge, who was at their apartment building, was completely shocked to hear about Dick's death on the radio. The same was true in Wisconsin, where the tragic news was heard on the radio before the Army had a chance to notify Dick's family. The death of America's ace of aces was reported on the front page of newspapers from coast to coast, right alongside the news that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. Two days after the crash, an Army transport flew Dick's casket and Marge home to Wisconsin. Marge so distraught that she was barely aware of what was happening. An enormous crowd gathered at the Concordia Lutheran Church for the funeral service, followed by Dick's burial in the Poplar Cemetery, with thousands of people lining the roads along the funeral procession. This now made 6 fatal accidents in P-80s, which were temporarily grounded while the Army and representatives from Lockheed and Allison conducted a thorough investigation. National outrage followed, with politicians and editorials demanding to know why such an irreplaceable pilot as Major Bong had been testing the trouble-plagued airplane in the first place. General Arnold responded that Dick had specifically asked to fly P-80s and had earned the right to receive his preferred assignment. Another disturbing outcome was the rumor that Dick had once again forgotten to turn on the emergency fuel pump before taking off. This was construed from a statement by the Army representative who inspected the P-80 before its acceptance check flight. He stated that the fuel pump switch was off when he checked over the cockpit, as it should have been, but Dick could very well have turned it on before he took off. This could not be determined from the wreckage, however, due to the total destruction of the cockpit. The Army's thorough investigation concluded that there was no indication of pilot error, yet the rumor persisted, unfairly, that Dick had forgotten to turn on that emergency fuel pump. The rumor might have faded away eventually, but almost 40 years later, it was revived by none other than Chuck Yeager, the test pilot credited with being the first person to break the sound barrier. In 1983, during an interview with journalist Robert Jones for People magazine, Yeager said, "Just being a fighter ace don't make you a test pilot. Look at Dick Bong. I saw him bust his ass. He forgot to turn on his fuel pump." But Yeager was actually in Ohio at Wright Field at the time of the accident. In 1985, when his autobiography was published, he refrained from claiming that he witnessed Bong's crash, but wrote instead that it was Bong's arrogance that got him killed. Yeager seemed disdainful of pilots who died in accidents during the early jet days, regardless of the cause, and his opinions offended plenty of people. Due to his achievements and fame, Yeager's opinions were taken as gospel truth, which left a lasting blemish on Richard Bong's legacy. The sad truth was that the growing pains involved with developing high-performance jet aircraft resulted in a lot of fatal accidents. Bong was just one of many talented aviators who died in the pioneering days of the first-generation jets. Nothing can overshadow what he accomplished during World War II as a modest young man in his early 20s. In his hands, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning was an effective and deadly weapon. Dick's score of 40 aerial victories remains the all-time American record, one that is unlikely to ever be surpassed, especially in this era of artificial intelligence and unmanned aircraft. Appropriately, his remarkable achievements during 3 combat tours in the Pacific have been permanently memorialized in several locations. The first was established in 1955 when a P-38 was placed near the school Dick attended as a boy in Poplar. The unveiling, attended by General George Kenney and many other dignitaries, drew a huge crowd. In 1963, a 4,500-acre state recreation area located approximately 30 miles south of Milwaukee, was named for Major Bong. And U.S. Route 2 across northern Wisconsin is named the Major Richard I. Bong Memorial Highway. It leads to an impressive 2-mile-long memorial bridge that opened in the mid-1980s, connecting Superior, Wisconsin with Duluth, Minnesota. The crown jewel among the memorial facilities is the Richard I. Bong Veterans Historical Center, which opened in 2002. Located in Superior, this nonprofit museum features world-class displays, including a P-38 with the Marge nose art and victory flags, along with exhibits dedicated to the Bong family farm and memorabilia from Dick's boyhood. The facility represents a living tribute not only to Major Bong, but to all veterans who have donned a uniform to serve their country. One of the most dedicated supporters during the facility's development was Marge. She had lived an exemplary life after Dick's tragic crash. She worked as a model, a magazine publisher, and an award-winning writer in California, before eventually returning to Wisconsin, where she spent her last few years near the Bong family farm in Poplar. Upon her death in 2003 at the age of 79, she was buried next to Richard in the Poplar Cemetery. And the Marge story didn't end with her passing. In the spring of 2024, 80 years after the original Marge P-38 crashed during a weather reconnaissance mission, the wreckage was discovered in the jungles of Madang Province, Papua New Guinea. The big fighter had crashed in March 1944 while being flown by Second Lieutenant Tom Malone, who bailed out due to engine failure in bad weather. He successfully made his way on foot to an American Army unit, lucky to have survived after parachuting over the extremely remote and inhospitable jungle terrain. The venture by the Pacific Rex Expedition in 2024, partially funded by the Bong Center, found the crash site on the steep slopes of a ravine deep in the jungle. Although not much of the shattered wreckage remained accessible, the team did find pieces that identified it as the original Marge aircraft, including the trademark red paint on a wingtip and the last 3 digits of the serial number. The remarkable discovery provided a fitting closure to the story of Richard Bong's unparalleled accomplishment as America's ace of aces and the storybook but ill-fated romance that he shared with Marge for a few months during World War II. If you have an opportunity to visit the Upper Midwest, be sure to include a trip to the Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin, where you can learn about a fascinating chapter in American history. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll consider subscribing and stay tuned for future content.